1. The weight of expectations. Aria Bennett stepped into the lecture hall, her fingers tightening around the strap of her backpack. The air inside was thick, heavy in a way that made it feel as though the walls themselves bore the weight of decades of pressure and expectation. She'd walked into spaces like this before, rooms where the people present had already made up their minds about her before she had the chance to speak. But today it felt different. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the sunlight filtered through the old windows, casting golden light onto the scuffed floors. Maybe it was the hushed whispers that stilled for half a beat when she passed, then picked up again behind her back. Or maybe it was something inside her, a quiet certainty that today would be a turning point. Whether in her favor or against her remained to be seen. Aria found her usual spot near the front, second row from the board. She always sat there, close enough to see every detail on the chalkboard, far enough to avoid being directly under Professor Aldrich Rowan's intense gaze. Around her, students whispered and chuckled quietly, some scrolling through their phones, others looking toward the door expectantly. The lecture hall was cavernous, with rows of wooden seats that curved upward in tiers, towering ceilings, and a giant chalkboard that covered nearly the entire front wall. It was the kind of place designed to remind students they were small, that their presence here was not a given. It had to be earned. The door at the back creaked open, and a hush fell over the room as Professor Rowan entered. His reputation preceded him. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly indifferent to his students' feelings. He took pride in breaking them down, claiming it was the only way to mold them into something stronger. But not everyone got the chance to be rebuilt. Aria had weathered pressure before. All-night study sessions, nerve-wracking competitions where one mistake could end her chances at a scholarship, and problem sets so complex they left her questioning everything she thought she knew. But this wasn't just about solving a problem. This was about belonging. 2. The challenge. Professor Rowan set his leather-bound notebook on the desk with a deliberate thump, his sharp gaze sweeping the lecture hall. He skimmed past the students in their tailored blazers and polished loafers until his eyes landed on Aria. A smile ghosted across his lips, not a friendly one. It was the kind of expression that suggested he had already decided how this would go. "Miss Bennett," he said slowly, dragging out her name as if tasting it. "Why don't you come up and demonstrate your understanding?" A ripple moved through the class. Not the usual fidgeting or shifting as people got settled. Something else. Curiosity, interest, amusement. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test, and not just an academic one. Aria knew exactly what this was. She closed her notebook carefully and rose from her seat, smoothing out her jacket with steady hands. She wasn't going to rush. She wasn't going to hesitate. Any sign of nervousness would be seen as confirmation of what they already believed. Professor Rowan handed her the chalk, stepping to the side with a flick of his wrist as if he were giving her free rein. But everyone knew this was anything but freedom. She turned to face the board, staring at the equation he had scrawled across its dark green surface. It was a beast of a problem, a multivariate function designed to trap students who didn't know how to navigate its complexities. She could feel the eyes on her. The whispers. "She's going to mess this up," someone murmured. "Bet she doesn't even know where to start," said another, their tone more skeptical than cruel. But she blocked them out. Numbers had always made sense in a way people didn't. The problem wasn't whether she could solve it. It was whether they were ready for her to. Taking a breath, Aria lifted the chalk and made her first mark. She wasn't just going to solve this. She was going to change the way they saw her. 3. Precision and silence. As the chalk touched the board, the room grew quieter. The rustle of papers, the tap of pens, all of it faded into stillness. She moved with certainty, writing out the first steps with crisp precision. She didn't hesitate, didn't fumble. Each line flowed logically into the next. A more conventional path would have worked, sure. But Aria saw something better, a more elegant solution that skipped unnecessary steps. It was the kind of shortcut someone who truly understood the material would take. A person who owned their knowledge rather than borrowed it. Professor Rowan stood off to the side, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But his gaze was sharp, following every movement of her hand. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting for her to slip up. Arya worked methodically, checking her work as she reached the midpoint. Not because she doubted herself, but because she'd learned early on that her work would always be scrutinized more than anyone else's. She wasn't going to give them anything to question. The whispers had stopped. Students who'd exchanged smirks earlier were now leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the board. She continued, each line of the solution unraveling the problem piece by piece, falling neatly into place. "She's actually doing it," someone whispered behind her. "And she's doing it fast," another added, grudgingly. Professor Rowan cleared his throat. "Make sure you're not skipping important steps, Miss Bennett." "I'm not," she replied, her voice calm, steady, absolute. A ripple of energy moved through the lecture hall. Not because of what she said, but how she said it. 4. The turning point. She finished the equation, drew a clean box around her answer, and stepped back, placing the chalk on the ledge. Silence hung thick in the air. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Professor Rowan stepped forward, his eyes scanning her work. He didn't speak right away, instead tracing each step with his fingertip, searching for the mistake he clearly believed had to be there. Arya watched him, arms crossed, waiting. Finally, he exhaled and stepped back. "Unorthodox," he said slowly, "but correct." The words echoed through the room. They were more than just an admission. He hadn't expected to say them. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Not just correct," said Dr. Evelyn Marlowe, standing from her seat in the back. "That was brilliant." Rowan's expression hardened. His fingers tapped restlessly against the podium. He turned back to the board, as if searching for a flaw, something he could use to take back control. But there was nothing. "Interesting," he said at last. "But let's examine it more closely." Arya exhaled quietly. Of course, he wasn't going to admit defeat. Not Professor Rowan. He was going to try to reframe the narrative. 5. Holding her ground. Rowan picked up a fresh piece of chalk, underlined part of her solution, and tilted his head. "You've bypassed the standard method here. Why did you assume this was the best approach?" It was a trap. He wasn't questioning her answer. He was questioning her authority to make the decision in the first place. Arya met his gaze evenly. "Because the traditional method introduces unnecessary steps. My approach eliminates redundant calculations and yields the answer more efficiently." A few students began scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "And what if I told you that skipping steps can lead to mistakes?" "It can," Arya said, but it didn't. A low chuckle rippled through the room. The tension cracked just slightly. Rowan's grip on the chalk tightened. "Confidence is commendable," he said. "Let's test it, shall we?" He quickly scrawled a second equation on the board, one even more complex, filled with nested variables, limits, and exponentials. He stepped back. "Let's see if your method holds up here." Without hesitation, Arya stepped forward and took the chalk. 6. The shift. She studied the problem. It was difficult, deliberately so, but not impossible. As she began to write, she felt the energy in the room shift. The students weren't just watching her anymore. They were invested. Pens hovered over notebooks, ready to jot down whatever insight she revealed. She worked methodically, with the same calm precision as before. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Professor Rowan remained silent, watching as the solution unfolded line by line. At last, she finished. "Box the answer. Step back. That's the solution," she said simply. Rowan stared at the board. His face was expressionless, but his silence spoke volumes. Dr. Marlowe approached the front. "That," she said, "is nothing short of genius." The students whispered among themselves, but this time it wasn't mockery. It was respect. She skipped 3 steps, one murmured, and still nailed it. "I wouldn't have thought to approach it that way," another admitted. 7. Recognition earned. As Arya returned to her seat, Dr. Marlowe stood by the board, arms crossed. "Not only is it correct," she said, but she found an optimization most students wouldn't consider. She turned to Rowan. You should be impressed. For a brief second, Rowan's jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. It's certainly a different approach. I'd call it advanced, Marlowe countered. She didn't just solve the problem. She mastered it. Rowan adjusted his tie, forced a smile. Yes. Well, we'll see how she performs on the next exam. Arya didn't flinch. She understood the implication. This wasn't over, but it didn't need to be. 8. A new perspective. As the lecture ended, students gathered their things. Some stole glances at Arya. Their expressions changed. One student, who had laughed at her earlier, lingered by her desk. That was impressive, he said awkwardly. You know, Arya replied, slinging her bay over her shoulder. He chuckled softly. All right then. As she walked out of the hall, the weight on her shoulders had lightened. Not because Rowan had conceded, he hadn't, not really, but because she had shifted something fundamental. She pulled out her phone. A text from her best friend, Jonah, popped up. Jonah, how was class? Arya's mute. Arya, same as usual, except I made Rowan eat his own words. Jonah, no way. What happened? Arya, let's just say he tried to embarrass me and ended up embarrassing himself. Jonah, about time someone stood up to that guy. Arya slipped her phone back in her pocket. One class wouldn't change everything, but it was a start. And for the students who came after her, it would mean something. Because respect isn't given. It's earned. And today, she had earned it. If you've ever felt underestimated, let this be your reminder. Your talent speaks for itself. You don't need permission to be great. Keep pushing. Keep proving them wrong. Back into Next Pointing Right if this story resonates with you. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter.